can change the world. One life, one heart, one soul, one mind at a time.
From Libyan revolutionaries to Viet Cong guerrillas to being jailed in Iran, John Graham has seen an awful lot, and we're going to talk with him today. John, welcome back.
Thanks very much.
You know, I say welcome back. We're actually, thank you very much for letting us come into your home and do this interview. Because the last time I think we were in an office, and the office just isn't as much fun.
Well, coming out to Whidbey Island on a summer day like today, I mean, we don't have to do a lot of pressing to get people to do that.
The thing that Dad said to us it was time to talk with John again was the fact that you were in Egypt just a short time before the government fell. Tell us just a little bit about that trip, and then we're going to come back to it a little later.
Well, the Giraffe Heroes Project, as you know, is moves people to stick their necks out for the common good. We've been doing it in this country for 30 years. And what I'm doing now is taking the Giraffe Heroes Project, its themes, its visions, its programs, to other countries, especially those where we think there's a real need for the hope and inspiration and political trainings that we offer. So Egypt was a perfect case in point. I mean, you had a revolution 2.5 years ago. The country was spiraling down economically. There was a great deal of tension between, and still is, between Islamic politicians and secular politicians, between Islamists and Christians, etc. And there was an absence, in our view, of a sense of I don't know, what might be called a vision of progress for the country. My own Egyptian friends were telling me that. So after a lot of emailing back and forth with my Egyptian friends, I decided that would be our next locus, our next plan to start a giraffe project, to do it in Egypt. We would start Giraffe Heroes Egypt, trying to do in Egypt what we've done in this country, which is to find that country's own heroes, going back, in their case, 5,000 years, and then to tell the stories of these heroes, Egyptians, men, women, and children, who have stuck their necks out to do things for the good of the nation or their own communities. And Lord knows there was plenty of opportunity for people to take risks, but a lot of the risks were simply moving to talk to people different than themselves. For example, it was really hard and really risky for a moderate Islamic politician to talk to a Christian politician.
In Egypt.
In Egypt. Or for a secular politician to talk to a far-right Islamist politician.
So everything's based on religion?
A lot of it is based on religion. It's a very religious country. I was amazed just walking the streets of Cairo how that, I don't know, perhaps 80% of the women wore the scarf, the hijab. Didn't mean that they were necessarily fundamentalist Islamic, but it did mean that they were observant Muslims.
Okay, let's stop right there because I want to come back to Egypt in depth. But first, for those who don't know John Graham, you've been traveling the world virtually your entire life. As we talked, Libyan revolutionaries, Viet Cong guerrillas being jailed in Iran, and that was all before you worked for the State Department, right?
Yes, most of it. No, I guess I got started when I was 17. I went to sea as a ordinary seaman on a freighter, sailing for the Far East, and when I was 17 years old. And coming out of Tacoma, Washington, I mean, I had a classic, middle-class upbringing in Tacoma, Washington, and I'd never been on any kind of an adventure before. And all of a sudden, I found myself in this freighter with these 50 tough guys on this freighter who were determined that my education was severely wanting and all the things they thought was important. So you can imagine, I learned a lot on that initial summer. And I got hooked. I got hooked on adventure. And it wasn't all a good thing. I'm going to be careful to say that. I got so hooked on adventure that nothing else mattered. Nothing else mattered but the adrenaline flows, and a lot of it was great stuff. I mean, I did a lot of mountain climbing, and in fact, I just got back from Alaska, the 50th anniversary of a climb I did with 6 other guys up the north wall of Mount McKinley, a climb so dangerous it's never been repeated. I hitchhiked around the world, which is where you said I was jailed in Iran. Well, yes, part of that. I spent 3 days in an Iranian jail, and it was one adventure after the other.
Well, that seems to be a bit adventuresome. Viet Cong guerrillas seems to be a bit adventuresome. Libyan revolutionaries, that seems to be a bit adventuresome as well.
that was all in the Foreign Service, because I realized that not being independently wealthy, that if I wanted to be an adventurer, I had to have someone pay me to do it. That sounds a little cynical. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. But the Foreign Service was, an obvious thing to do. So I passed the exams and got into the Foreign Service. And I didn't get into the part of the Foreign Service that puts on nice clothes and parades around in embassies in London and Paris. My beat in the Foreign Service was jungles and deserts, arms sales. I laugh now.
Arms sales? I want to make sure that I...
Arms sales, that is to say, fighter aircraft and whatever. And I laugh now because a lot of people who are my dear friends now were picketing people like me in the 60s. Anyway, that's what it was. That's what I was doing. And it just sort of like, my perspective, I think, got lost. I ended up in the revolution in Libya, which was exciting enough. I was there when Muammar Gaddafi came to power in 1969. In fact, I did the first biographic reports on the guy. Then after that, it was the war in Vietnam. And there was a real comeuppance then, because now I wasn't a kid anymore. And I was in the middle of a shooting war. And people were dying or living because of decisions I was making. And yet I was in Vietnam, not as a patriot, not even as a soldier. I was there as a civilian. And I was just there for the adventure of it. And to some extent the power, because I was good at my job. I was going up rapidly in the ranks in the Foreign Service. But there was no moral context to it.
No moral context to being a diplomat?
There was no moral context in what I was doing, which was being in a dangerous place with the power of life and death, and yet not really giving a damn who won. I didn't go over there as a patriot. I didn't go over there. I thought the war was lost from the beginning, but it was the only war we had. It was my adventure. That's what I meant by moral quandary. And it wasn't until a terrible battle in Hue in 1971, the so-called Easter Offensive. It's in the history books. I won't go into it except that it was I was in a place where I had to order a firing squad to be set up. And the idea was to start shooting South Vietnamese soldiers who had deserted, run away from the battle. And yet these deserters were young farm boys who had been dragooned off their paddies just weeks before. They were innocent, and yet that's what I was doing. And it suddenly hit me that I shouldn't be there. I shouldn't be making these decisions. I wasn't qualified to make these decisions. And it was a sort of long, dark night of the soul, of really coming to grips with the fact that adventure was great, but if it had no moral context, then it was not so great. So I gradually began to climb out the other side of that, and I think in the last years of my life, the last 30 years or so, have taken my yen for adventure and the fact that I'm pretty good at it into trying to make the world a better place, working primarily with the Giraffe Heroes Project, and most recently, as you said, by going to Egypt and trying to help people there create a stable and prosperous democracy.
Well, let's talk about Egypt then. Let's go fast forward now to, I guess it was May 2013. You were in Egypt, and tell us how it was on the ground. What were the people talking about? Did the people care that you didn't look like them, probably didn't talk like them?
It's interesting. When I went there, first of all, I was warned not to go there.
No kidding.
Well, no kidding, right. The embassy was warning American citizens. Even my Egyptian friends were saying, John, this is the you-know-what's about to hit the fan over here, and if you're here in the wrong place, the wrong time, it could be a serious mistake for you. Well, that, of course, was an invitation to me, given my background. So I went over to Egypt, and I found that I was completely safe. I talked to Egyptians from all walks of life, Islamists, secularists, Christians, of course, men and women, politicians, media people, leaders of NGOs, educators, teachers. trying to figure out what was going on in Egypt beyond the news, beyond CNN. And I was perfectly safe. I even got caught up in a demonstration in Tahrir Square. Not a huge one, but a demonstration.
Yeah, which side were you on that day?
Well, I wasn't on any side. I was just there talking to people, and then all of a sudden this crowd of people came storming out of a side street with their banners and everything. I couldn't get out of the way, so I decided to join them. And I think it was an anti-Morsi protest, but mostly it was a food protest. And I thought, well, okay, I'll join that protest. So I hung out with the demonstrators for an hour or so, and they were actually sorry to see me go. So I had no problems, and what I did have was a remarkable experience in talking to a number of really brave and creative people. So I came away from Egypt with a lot more hope than when I went there, mostly because of the people.
What do the people want?
They want what everybody wants. They want a stable government, stable communities where they can go out at night and not be gunned down or caught in a riot or shot by security police. They want modest prosperity. They want a job. They want gas prices that aren't spiraling through the roof. They want a chance of looking forward to a future where their children and grandchildren might grow up and go to college and become, I don't know, experts in this or that.
But didn't they have a revolution about those same things a couple of years ago?
They did. They did. And when they threw out Mubarak in 2011, it was almost reminiscent of something that happened in this country. They were talking about hope and change, and when they'd thrown out Mubarak, a man who'd been their strongman, their dictator for 30-some years, using the army to provide the muscle to keep everything the way he wanted it, when they threw him out, they really thought that they had created that change, but they had not. They had not, because the rifts in Egypt were way deeper than just this one man, this Mubarak.
What are the rifts in Egypt?
The rifts in Egypt primarily are religious based. There is a strong segment of fairly fundamentalist Muslims. They are organized mostly in a group called the Muslim Brotherhood. To their right, even further right than the Muslim Brotherhood, is another group called the Salafists, who are their right wing. And these people would like to create a theocracy in Egypt, or at least something like Saudi Arabia, where, for example, women can't drive, and so-called Sharia law is an oppressive force on society. And most other Egyptians are more secular than that. Now, Egypt is not a backwater. There's a lot of very well-educated Egyptians.
So well-educated, and they probably have a decent infrastructure?
They have a decent infrastructure. The literacy rate is remarkably high, especially in the capital city.
And then people from the United States and the Western world have been traveling to Cairo for years, for generations, because of what they have there.
Yes.
But that's stopped now, hasn't it?
Well, the travel of people, of non-Americans to Egypt has stopped because of the danger.
So are the people, I mean, the people that you saw, they're on the streets of Cairo. Did you see the military as well?
Yes, and the military, when I was there, were not so much weren't. There was no military violence. I saw no military violence. Because
the military, in this instance, they were this year's revolutionaries, right?
Yes and no. The business of what's going on in Egypt is so darn complicated. But basically what happened was the Muslim Brotherhood, after the 2011 elections, there was a 2011 coup. Mubarak is thrown out. The army steps in and says, we're going to keep the lid on this for 6 months while you guys organize an election and a constitution. They did that. There was an election, which most people said was fair, but the only people organized to win elections were the Muslim Brotherhood. This is the group, as I said before, that many of whom would like to turn Egypt into something approaching a theocracy, or at least something like Saudi Arabia. The secularists didn't want that, but they were poorly organized, so they lost the election. Muslim Brotherhood elects the president, And instead of reaching out to try to create a government of national unity, to understand that at least for a while they had to work together with other parties, Mr. Morsi, who was the president of the Muslim Brotherhood, took many steps that now in retrospect most analysts regard as being very heavy-handed and too dismissive of the needs of the rest of the people who were not part of his Muslim-based party. So he quickly became very unpopular in Egypt, and that started the rumblings that grew into the crescendo that came to a head last June 30th. When he, in fact, was thrown out, the army came back in. Mm-hmm. It's really funny because, it isn't funny, but the army now is playing a very similar role to what it played 2.5 years ago. When it came in, sort of separated the warring parties and says, we're going to take control of the country while you guys try and sort out a civilian government. And that's what's now happened. There's an interim prime minister, elections will be scheduled in 6 months, and they're going to try again.
We here in the United States like to use the word democracy and put it up on a pedestal that's far beyond what reality is in other countries. Can we here in the United States expect democracy of the American kind to work in Egypt and other places?
That's a really good question, because most people, Democrats, small d Democrats, like to see elections in the so-called developing world. We think that's better than having a strongman or a dictator or whatever. So in Egypt, once they threw out Mubarak, they had what were regarded widely as free and fair elections. So we would applaud. Oh, wonderful! Egypt has elections. Everything now is wonderful. Well, that wasn't what happened, because as I was explaining earlier, democracy is more than just winning elections, and only one class of society, the Muslim Brotherhood, their one party rather, had any skill at politicking. So they won the election, but it turned out they weren't very fit to govern. So, all right, did democracy work? Well, yes, but no. So now you have the curious phenomena where the secular politicians, the small d Democrats, are applauding a military coup. And it's like you shake your hand and say, wait a minute. You guys should be against military coups. Well, no, not really, because the last time we had an election, we elected someone that turned out to be not at all what we wanted, and so we want him thrown out. And if the army did it, we applaud them. So now we're back to what is democracy in Egypt. It certainly isn't the same thing that we're used to in this country. It's very complicated.
It sounds very complicated. So I'm going to ask you, because you were over there with Giraffe Heroes, who are the heroes over there?
I think the heroes in Egypt are mostly people who are willing to reach out in a deeply polarized society to people that don't believe what they believe, to people who of another faith, and say, look, I don't agree with you guys, but we're going to, where in a handbasket unless we work together. So I'm reaching out to you. Let's see if we can make the trains run on time. Let's see if we can make the economy work. Let's see if we can organize a government that works for the good of the people and solve some of the social and economic problems we've got. Yes, we'll fight on elections. You think that, I think that. But we've got to do it. And the parallels with this country, some people criticize me saying, you're saying Egypt was like the United States? Well, the Tea Party and the liberal left in America, huge split. Only we at least have a constitution and 200 years of history with some hope that we might actually work things out. In Egypt, that doesn't exist.
They have 2,000 years of history of not working things out.
Well, they have even more 2,000. You go back to the initial realms of the pharaohs. It was all top-down autocracy. And then you had military dictatorships ending with Mubarak.
So I guess that's my main question. Can we in the West expect people to move from generations, thousands probably of generations, of an autocracy To move into where the people are in control overnight.
No. And I just remind my American friends, those of us that remember our grade school history, that it took 13 years for us after our revolution before we finally wrote a constitution, when we realized that the initial government we thought that would work in 1776 didn't work at all. And then it took another, 60, 70 years, and we fought a civil war to again reshape the country and reshape the way we would live together. So that the Egyptians, who have virtually no history in making a democracy work, and no history in writing and living a constitution, should not manage to get it perfect in 3 years, hey, it's probably to be expected.
John, there's lots of countries I'd like to talk with you about, and we're not going to have time, but I want to talk about Tibet. The reason I'm talking about that is because there are so many people that don't understand when we're driving on the highway and all of a sudden we see a bumper sticker that says "Free Tibet,"
Right.
And we're wondering, what is that about? What is that about? You wrote about it in your blog a few years ago.
I did, and I was lucky to get into Tibet. The Chinese are very, very nervous about Tibet. It's they've, as your listeners know, they've taken over the country decades ago and have ruled it ever since with an iron fist.
Why? I mean, it's like on top of the world.
Well, it's interesting. You have to go back again a long, long time. I won't do it, but I mean, the Tibetans and Chinese have been fighting for well over 1,000 years. Sometimes the power shifts one way, sometimes the other. Right now, clearly, Tibet is a minor part, a minor country, and China is a hugely powerful country. And Tibet is on the border, if you will, a buttress against the West. So China really wants Tibet as that buffer, and they want to control Tibet.
But they think people are going to climb up over the mountains of Tibet and into China? I mean, I don't get it.
Well, that's a very good question. They are fearful partly because of this 1,000 years of history, partly because the Tibetans are vocal, largely through the person of the Dalai Lama, who is very critical of Chinese government. And those of us that watch the Chinese Olympic Games, for example, the Chinese were desperately trying to paint themselves as a modern, progressive, forward-looking country. And then all these shots come in from Tibet of Chinese troops beating up Tibetans in the streets and Tibetan monks immolating themselves because of the attacks on their faith and whatever. So I wanted to see for myself. And I knew the Chinese wouldn't let someone like me into the country if they knew what my my purposes were. But I submitted my visa application as kind of like a bucket list item. This aging old American, 68 years old, just wanted to see Tibet before he cashed in. And I relied on the hope that some third-level Chinese diplomat would not look too closely at who I was or do any research on
okay,
who
so
I
worked.
was. It worked. But I still had to get permissions from 5 different Chinese ministries, including the secret police and the army and everybody else. And I did so, and to my great surprise, I ended up flying into Lhasa from Kathmandu, and then to my even greater surprise, got permission to travel overland throughout the whole Tibetan plateau, and then back down overland to Kathmandu. So I was in the Tibetan, in the capital, Lhasa, and then in the hinterlands for over a week, making copious notes, taking as many pictures as I thought I could get away with, stuffing the notes in my shoes because I knew the Chinese would search me at the border. And what I saw, I mean, what was I writing down in those notes? Well, I wrote, I believe in my blog, I call it a cultural genocide. Very strong words, but I think they're accurate. The Chinese have pumped an enormous amounts of money into Tibet. So you have this strange picture. You come in from the airport in Lhasa, and it looks like you're in a Phoenix suburb, parks and beautiful streets and not much pollution and, well-dressed people. You go a few hundred yards beyond this Potemkin village, and you see that the Tibetan people have been pushed to one side. Most of the people living in Lhasa now are Han Chinese, not Tibet. And out on the countryside, yes, there's some great new roads, hospitals, schools. For example, I was able to call home on my cell phone from 18,000 feet on Mount Everest because the Chinese have put cell phone towers every place in the country, including ones that would make my cell phone operate from 18,000 feet on the north side of Mount Everest.
And your first words were, "Can you hear me now?"
I did. I think we captured that on the home answering machine. It's like, "Ann, I'm calling you from Mount Everest." Anyway, there are also electric power grids throughout the country. So they've done all this stuff. Basically, I will be, again, blunt, as a bribe. And it to some extent worked. There are quite a few Tibetans who are quite happy to have all this, but they're not happy with the fact that they have almost no freedoms. And the self-government of Tibet is a sham. The Chinese run everything. And you walk in Lhasa and this Phoenix suburb, except that every block and a half there's an army guard post with 6 or 8 fully clad police in riot gear with automatic weapons. Once we started driving, every 20 miles or so there'd be a police checkpoint where people would go through my permissions and passports and stuff. And I had a minder, by the way. My driver was also my minder. And if I wanted to talk to
What's a minder?
Oh, sorry. Someone that had to report back to the Chinese government.
Oh.
I could take my computer with me, but if I started typing anything that went beyond the sky is blue, all of a sudden the screen would go blank. Or if I typed in the words Dalai Lama, all of a sudden Chinese characters would come all over my screen. So it was pretty apparent they were watching every move I was making. But it was what was happening was so obvious. I didn't have to do anything, subterranean to see it. The Chinese are trying to kill the Tibetans with kindness, but they're also doing it with a very strict police state apparatus.
But realistically, the Tibetans are on their own because the West is not going to come to their defense.
No, we are not. We have too many important fish to fry, if you will, in our overall relationships with the Chinese. So we may irk the Chinese by receiving the Dalai Lama in the White House or whatever, but we're not going to go beyond that. It's one of those cases where realpolitik is just what's going to happen.
John, I got an hour's worth of questions and 30 seconds left. Are there heroes in Tibet?
Yes, there are heroes in Tibet, and there are people who are willing to stand up to what's happening and to get the word out of what the Chinese are doing. I mean, you can look at what's happening in Tibet, and if you're blinded or want to be blinded, you can see that you can believe the Chinese propaganda, but the Tibetans need to tell the world that is not what's happening.
John, thank you very much. That's been John Graham. Go to the website giraffe.org. We'll see you next time right here. Take care.